Please welcome Rabbi Michael Latz, Senior Rabbi, Shir Tikva, Minneapolis, Minnesota, member of J Street's Rabbinic Cabinet.
Thank you. When my 11-year-old daughter was recently asked about a place in the world that makes her happy, she recalled our trip to Israel last summer. Reflexively, without thinking, from a place deep inside her kishkas, she answered without any hesitation, the gelato place on Emek Rephaim across from the swimming pool, the one down the street from the waffle restaurant. Last June, I led a congregational trip of 36 members of our shul to Israel for 2 weeks, and afterwards, we stayed as a family for the first 2 weeks of July. I studied at the Hartman Institute's Rabbinic Torah Studies Seminar. Give a good shout out to Hartman. My husband explored archaeological sites, and our daughters swam in the pool on Emek Rephaim, ate gelato every day, and attended the Ramah day camp. But it was not a typical summer in Israel. As violence once again erupted between Israelis and Palestinians, we attended a shiva for Naftali and Gilad and Eyal, Zichronam Livracha, the 3 Jewish teenagers murdered in the West Bank. We went to the mourning tent for Mohammed Abu Qadir, the Palestinian teenager murdered by Jewish extremists in Jerusalem. And as rockets found their way to Jerusalem airspace for the first time since the Gulf War, despite everyone's disbelief, we also spent time in the Miklat, the bomb shelter. My 7.5-year-old loves maps. We have a photograph of her when she was 2 years old on a giant map of the world in our living room and pointing to the countries of the world as we called out their names. It was and it remains a favorite game of ours. And so on the day that we drove from the depths of the Mitzpeh Ramon crater to the heights of the Golan, she, who reliably tracked our travels across the map of Israel, asked me what the green line was. Daddy, what is that green line? How do you answer a 7-year-old? How do you explain occupation, morality, Jewish values? How do you explain 1948 and 1967 and 1973 and 1982 and the First Intifada and the Second Intifada and the bus bombings and terror attacks and the withdrawal from Gaza and the Oslo Peace Accords and Rabin Zichrono Livracha and Peres and Arafat and Netanyahu and Abbas and Operation Cast Lead and Protective Edge and areas A, B, and C? And how do you translate for a 7-year-old the word miklat? For a parent who believes in telling his kids the truth, albeit in developmentally appropriate ways, I was uncharacteristically and agonizingly silent. Well, I stammered, it's complicated, you see. The green line represents the land that Israel controls and occupies, and I got a 7-year-old eye roll. Too much? Too much. She headed to the back of the bus to watch videos with the rest of the kids. But still, I was relieved, knowing that we may not have covered every facet of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but we had begun an important conversation that would surely continue in the years to come. I am here today and I support J Street with all my heart because I owe my daughters an honest conversation about Israel. My daughters, named Noah and Liat, love Israel, and they ask every single day when we are going back, because as their parents, we have done an outstanding job to help them fall in love with the land and people of Israel. At our Seders next month, at our Sedarim, we will ask about the child who does not know enough to ask. So long as the green line is absent from too many maps in the Jewish community, our children are not being given the tools to ask the right questions. Too often, those of us in the Jewish world withhold this information from our kids. We omit the green line. We've become experts in conflict avoidance around the occupation, somehow out of fear that it could tarnish their love for Israel. But in reality, it's the occupation itself and the lack of a two-state solution that jeopardizes the future of Israel that I love and that my daughters love. By using maps with a green line and asking others to do the same, we are taking responsibility for our role in this conflict, and we are acting responsibly to our children. For all of us, the act of questioning, the great spiritual tradition of Jewish questioning, opens up the possibility of considering a different future and a better future. And I ask you now, I pray and I hope, please join me in taking this important step and commit to working for an Israel worthy of all of our Jewish moral integrity and my daughter's dreams. Thank you.
Please welcome Benji Cannon, President, J Street U National Student Board.
Hello, my name is Benji Cannon, and I am the proud president of the J Street U National Board. This summer, after the Gaza war, former director of the Jewish Policy Planning Institute, Anthony Lerman, penned a provocative op-ed for the New York Times Magazine titled "The End of Liberal Zionism." Whether you agreed with the piece or not, it posed some critical questions about the fundamental premises that underlie the work that we do in the pro-Israel, pro-peace movement. Are liberal values compatible with nationalism? Can you be an ardent supporter of Zionism, the national project of the Jewish people, and remain true to a value system grounded in liberalism and respect for rights for all? How important is the realization of the two-state solution to the viability of liberal Zionism? Can the pursuit of a liberal Zionist vision be separated from the pursuit of a two-state solution? And, as a two-state solution seems ever harder to achieve, does liberal Zionism have a future? J Street believes in Israel as a democratic homeland of the Jewish people, a vision that demands an end to the occupation and achievement of a two-state solution to the conflict with the Palestinian people. Is Lerman right that our vision is no longer attainable? J Street also believes that there must be a space for open and rigorous conversation about Israel and Israeli policy in this country for the sake of Israel's future. It is in that spirit that we welcome our guests to the stage and all of you in the audience into a conversation that delves into many of the questions raised in the article. Peter Beinart is an associate professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York. He is also a contributor to The Atlantic and National Journal, a senior columnist for Haaretz, a CNN political commentator, and a senior fellow at the New America Foundation. He is the author of The Crisis of Zionism, The Icarus Syndrome, and The Good Fight. Beinart has written for the New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and Financial Times, among others. Marcia Friedman emigrated to Israel from the US in 1967. There, she was one of the founders and leaders of the feminist movement. Friedman served in the Knesset from 1973 to 1977. She was then a rare voice for women's issues and the two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Friedman, who returned to the States in 1981, was elected founding president of Brit Tzedek V'Shalom in 2002. She's the author of Exile in the Promised Land and the soon-to-be-published Sitting Shiva, A Ghost Story. Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum serves as the spiritual leader of New York City's congregation Beit Simchat Torah, the largest LGBTQ synagogue in the world. Woo! She is a commissioner on New York City's Commission on Human Rights, served on Mayor Bill de Blasio's Faith-Based Advisory Council and the U.S. Department of State's Religion and Foreign Policy Sub-Working Group on Social Justice. Member of Knesset Stav Shafir, of Israel's Labor Party, is the youngest female Knesset member in history. During her first term, she served on the Knesset Finance Committee, where she exposed Israel's secret budget and fought to stop corrupt usage of taxpayer money. Stav was one of the leaders of the Israeli social protest movement that brought hundreds of thousands of Israelis into the streets in the summer of 2011. She has been featured in the New York Times and on the BBC, and her columns have been published in Haaretz, Yeridot Achronot, and the Jewish Review of Books. Noam Shezaf is an Israeli journalist. He's the editor and executive director of 972 magazine, where he also blogs. Noam writes mostly about Israeli politics, the diplomatic process, and the occupation. His work has been published in Haaretz, Mariv, The Daily Beast, The Nation, Foreign Affairs, and other publications. Moderating the discussion is Daniel Levy, the Middle East director at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Daniel is also a senior fellow at the New America Foundation and the Century Foundation, and the founding editor of the Middle East Channel. Levy was an Israeli official for the Israeli-Palestine talks at Taba and Oslo, as well as being a lead drafter of the Model Geneva Initiative peace agreement. Levy also helped found J Street and serves on the boards of the New Israel Fund, Molad, and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Let us welcome our panelists.
Bloody hell, I sit next to you. Do I wait for a signal from Rachel? No. Well, thank you, Rabbi Michael Lax and Benji Cannon. And if I may, let me just say how remarkable it is, 7 years after J Street was founded, to see not only so many of you who were there when we established J Street and in the run-up to establishing J Street, but also so many of you who have joined this journey along the way, including so many of you who were barely teenagers when we established J Street. And it's remarkable to see so many people in a room to discuss liberal Zionism. I'm not sure this would happen in Israel, and maybe that's a theme we will return to in the fullness of our conversation here. I know there have been a lot of furrowed brows and expressions of concern in this city in recent weeks that Israel is in danger of becoming a partisan issue. And I just pose the question to people, maybe one can have an attitude of bring it on. If there is a pro-occupation, pro-Israel community out there, and if there is a status quo, we ain't going to do anything about it, pro-Israel community out there, then someone needs to own, in a partisan fashion, the anti-occupation, pro-Israel space. And if there is a Jewish rights come before universal human rights pro-Israel community out there, and a meh, can we change the subject, please, pro-Israel community out there, then there needs to be a universal human rights are fundamental to our Jewish values pro-Israel community out there. And if there is a pro-dog whistle racism election campaigning pro-Israel community out there, and if there is a special pleading when it comes to racist dog whistles pro-Israel community out there, then we sure as hell need a this is contemptible and unacceptable pro-Israel community out there. And I know it's very fashionable in this city to triangulate, but really those are 3 weddings you can't dance at. at the same time. I want to salute what my friends and former colleagues in J Street have achieved, not least in this last period, in helping create the political space for a negotiation and potentially a deal which I think would serve not only American but also Israeli interests on one of the issues that has been with us for so long, which is the Iran nuclear talks. And for doing something which I think is remarkably responsible, which is pushing back against an attempt by an Israeli prime minister, which I think is an incredibly bad idea, to try to own torpedoing and sabotaging talks and moving this country potentially closer to war. I don't know who is using and instrumentalizing each other more, the GOP or the Israeli prime minister. But something happened in this town since that invitation by Speaker Boehner, since that speech by Prime Minister Netanyahu, since those last days of the election campaign, and since the response of the administration to those last days. And I would argue that what has happened is that quite consciously, Prime Minister Netanyahu shrunk the consensus on Israel in this town. And President Obama has now stepped out of the comfort zone on Israel in this town. And I would argue that our challenge is to step out of our own comfort zones, individually, collectively, institutionally. And that, for me, forms the backdrop for, it's a fascinating collection of activism and intellectual leadership that I have arrayed, and you have arrayed, in front of you. And I won't repeat the introductions that were given. And my sense at this J Street conference is we're trying to balance the sense of urgency. What do we do in the light of what's happened here that I just described, and in the light of what happened there in Israel just a few days ago? And somehow we have to balance the urgency with the understanding that we already had, but it was brought home with I think, great clarity. But there's no silver bullet. This is going to be a long struggle. And where does the default framing of liberal Zionism fit in to addressing that challenge that we have today? Do you double down on the default liberal Zionist position? Do you reframe it? Do you fundamentally step out of that box? And I'm delighted that I can apparently go so up and down in my volume just by moving my neck muscle. But I'm also delighted at the group of people I can turn to address this question. Before I do that, you will see, I think, cards in front of you on the tables. And what we're going to do in this session is have you, fill out any questions you'd like to address to the panelists. The J Street folks will be moving around the tables. Those cards will be rigorously censored, and then some of them will make their way to me up here on the podium. And I'm going to start with you, Marcia, because I kind of feel that your own story may be the best way to begin the journey of this panel, to look at your own journey. Born in Newark, New Jersey, and you insisted on reminding me that fourth largest Jewish community at the time in the United States. You made Aliyah in '69. You served in the Knesset with Rutz, one of the forerunner parties to Meretz. You came back to the States. You went back to Israel. You came back and were a founder of Brit Tzedek V'Shalom. Now, that's an amazing story. The theme of this panel is, does liberal Zionism have a future? But let's ground it in something. And maybe, Marcia, you can share with us whether you feel liberal Zionism had a past and how your own journey fits with your thinking and what you can share with us and where liberal Zionism was and where it's gone to.
Okay. I think I'm up here as the grandmother of liberal Zionism.
There you go. And if you weren't, you certainly are now.
But we do want grandmothers around, so yes. I want to begin by saying to you that I have never considered myself to be a liberal nor a Zionist. I've never been an anti-Zionist, and I've not been illiberal, but I have never used any of those labels. However, I would describe myself in 1967, the first year I went to Israel and then moved back permanently in 1969, I would describe myself as a run-of-the-mill American Jewish liberal, who, when I got to Israel and began to be active politically, discovered that I was considered to be a radical. And I was considered to be a radical because I talked about not just the peace issue, and I was talking about a two-state solution in the mid-1970s, one of probably 10 Israelis who were doing that. That's not necessary. I was considered to be a radical because and not only just because I was talking about feminism, but because I was talking about racism, because I was talking about equality, income equality, and other sorts of liberal democratic concepts that we have and share in this room. And I think that you would all find that if you spent a lot of time in Israel, and you might disagree with me, Stav, but I'm not positive, because there are voices talking about these things today, certainly more than ever. And I want to point out the first time I ever heard publicly the word racism in Hebrew, gizanut, was in 1995 when I went back. We found that there was, Shulamit Aloni, who was the founder of RATZ, the party that I was elected with and who got me elected, talked about human rights and civil rights. Well, she was a very radical voice in Israel and a very singular voice in Israel talking about human rights and civil rights. She had constantly to explain what she was talking about and what she meant and what was important. So I think that a lot of the things that we take for granted in as our political home and shared framework doesn't really exist in Israel, even today. Maybe it exists a bit more, but I don't think it really exists in Israel. The other thing that I want to say to you, which is going to be quite a bit controversial, is that I remained a non-liberal, non-Zionist, social democrat for most of my life. I supported the two-state solution, as I said, from very, very early on and up until a few years ago, literally, when I finally did come to the conclusion after too many governments in Israel failed to make peace with the Palestinians, that there was no longer really a possibility of a two-state solution, not because there's no partner for peace on the Palestinian side, but because I don't believe there's a real partner for peace in power on the Israeli side, nor do I think that any partner in power on the Israeli side, no matter who it was going to be able to give back territory and to allow the establishment of a Palestinian state. Once we had that land, we were not about to give it up. And I believe I was entirely naive for many, many decades, literally, in believing that that was possible.
Thank you. And I'm sure we're going to pick up on some of those themes, not least the one at the end there, as this conversation moves along. Peter, if anyone owns the liberal Zionist brand in this country, I think it's you. And excellent, that's taken as a positive. You've gone on your own journey from, I think, an essay that had a dramatic impact on the Jewish leadership's position on checking liberalism in at Zionism's door and what that would do to the young community, the younger members, to your book, The Crisis of Zionism. Zionist BDS has the Peter Beinart intellectual copyright stamp on it, and now a pressure-centric agenda post-elections. And I'm sure we'll have a chance in the panel, and Marsha already referred to it, ideas that were kind of milquetoast Jewish American liberalism are radical in Israel, and I would kind of see your Israeli liberal Zionist brand owner twin as being Ari Shavit, and I don't think you could get more of a contrast, really, between yourself and Ari Shabi. But you're talking pressure post-elections, he's talking apologetica. But we'll come back to that. But where might you take us next on, well, it's your journey, but I think many people feel it's our shared journey after this election. And where do you think Washington goes, or should go?
Thanks. Well, look, there's nothing special about the term liberal Zionism. Maybe it has a certain resonance for Americans for a particular reason. It may not in Israel. But I think what's important is that Israel has a Declaration of Independence that, written in the shadow of the Holocaust, which pledges that this state will not only be a refuge for Jews, but that it will try to pursue freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the Hebrew prophets. It seems to me, when I talk about liberal Zionism, that's what I mean. I mean a country that offers refuge to Jews in distress in a post-Holocaust world, so we never again find ourselves as a people who are threatened and don't have at least one country in the world that has Jewish survival as its mission statement, and a country that believes that at the core of its identity must be the pursuit of freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the Hebrew prophets. I think that the debate in the United States may have changed more in the last 2 or 3 months than it's changed in my entire adult lifetime. It's quite a remarkable thing to see. I think the first thing that's happened is that Benjamin Netanyahu has essentially destroyed the American Jewish center. The American Jewish center is essentially made up of Democrats who claim to support the two-state solution. May not really want to actually do anything about it, but claim to support it, and who rely on the fig leaf of bipartisanship and the fig leaf of an Israeli government that rhetorically at least supports the two-state solution in order to deal with the basic contradiction between their desire to not criticize Israel, their desire to be in the Democratic Party, and their desire to, at some level, take ownership of the fact that it is hideously violates their own beliefs for Israel to permanently control millions of people who lack basic rights. What Benjamin Netanyahu has done is he has taken that fig leaf away from them. He has said, essentially, you can't do it anymore. That he has exposed the American Jewish establishment for essentially what it is, a set of institutions that is drifting more and more into the Republican camp, and that is, at its core, one statist in character. And I think he is forcing people to choose. And that is what makes this such an interesting moment. He's also forced the Obama administration off the sidelines. I think the Obama administration would have been very, very happy to leave this issue be for the rest of the Obama administration. They have a lot of other things on the agenda. Benjamin Netanyahu has made that impossible for them because they have been there holding off pressure from the Palestinians at the United Nations by saying to basically everyone in the world, no, 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 there is the possibility of a negotiated two-state solution between these two parties because they both believe in the two-state solution. Benjamin Netanyahu destroyed that argument for them. It made that argument impossible for them, and it has forced them off the sidelines onto the field. I'm very consciously using the football metaphor that Jeremy Ben-Ami used when J Street was created. You were created to block? Well, good news. You finally have someone willing to run the ball. But, so the question is now, how do we block? How do we make this possible? I don't think the Obama administration has figured out what it's going to do, but it is actually willing to think boldly, I think, for the first time in a long time. The first thing we have to do is we have to fight the idea that Israel's permanent occupation of the West Bank has democratic legitimacy because Benjamin Netanyahu won the election. Israeli democracy, in many ways, is a wonderful thing. But it is utterly perverse to say that because Israel held an election in which people could vote inside the green line, and that they were able to vote to permanently bar people beyond the green line from citizenship and the right to vote in any country, that therefore that permanent undemocratic situation in the West Bank has a democratic imprimatur. It does not have a democratic imprimatur. The second thing we need to do is we need to think very hard and very creatively about how we amplify Palestinian nonviolent protest in the West Bank. And I think the best way we could do that would be to be there ourselves. The more we are there ourselves at those nonviolent protests in the West Bank, the more the conscience of the American Jewish community will be shaken in the same way the conscience of the American Jewish community and the entire population of white America was shaken when it was white kids who went to Mississippi in the 1960s and saw what African Americans were enduring every day. Once America's rabbis have to face the parents whose children are being tear gassed and shot with rubber bullets in the West Bank. Once the American Jewish local newspapers have to write about it because it's the kids from their day schools who are at those protests, then the American Jewish community will not be able to ignore it anymore. And the last point is we have to prepare for a fight at the UN, because I think that's where by this fall we may end up. That Barack Obama's last move may be to try to leave the legacy of a set of parameters that will define what a two-state solution looks like. And this will be fought brutally by the American Jewish leadership and by the Republican Party. And I don't think Barack Obama is likely to get a lot of support from Hillary Clinton. He needs support from you, because this effort at putting the Security Council's stamp on parameters for a two-state solution, I think, is the most important move that he can realistically make in the rest of his presidency. I don't think he'll do it in 2016 in an election year, but he may do it in 2015. It will produce a very, very, very bitter and heated political fight, and he is more willing to take that on, more likely to take that on, if he knows that he will have people in the Jewish community behind him. I think that's where we're going. I think it's going to be a really important moment for all of you. Thanks.
I want to stay on this side of the divide, because if Peter's even part right, that's going to be a heck of an interesting time to navigate if you're a communal rabbi. And I want to turn to someone who is in that position, to Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum. How would you react to that? You already shared with me that you've had members of your congregation saying, how do I even call myself a liberal Zionist anymore? Does this become a whole new set of challenges? Is it too painful? Do you kind of segue away from a central role that Israel plays? I think you have a potential trend that says we can live a fully fulfilled Jewish life here, and that's just too difficult to deal with. Or is there a way of taking that message forward with your and other congregations?
Well, I'd have to say the first thing I would want to do as a congregational rabbi being on this panel is to have the two of you come to my congregation and speak and ensure there are Jewish spaces in which this range of points of view and these points of view are welcomed into Jewish spaces to be discussed. That would be a change. I think that's fundamentally the first issue we're facing, is the censorship and the shutting down of Jewish spaces to a range of voices. I often say you could go into almost any synagogue in America, and I'm only saying almost, so I'm covering myself, but I would even say any synagogue in America, and maybe even any synagogue worldwide, and ask the rabbi of any denomination for a conversation and say to that rabbi, you know what? I hate God. I don't believe in God. I'm an atheist. Would that rabbi throw you out of the synagogue? Unlikely. The rabbi would say, let's talk about it, let's study some Torah together, let's discuss what you mean by God. You just don't yet understand God, but you're still a Jew. Why is it that you can go into almost any synagogue in America and say, I am troubled by what Israel is doing, I am an anti-Zionist or a non-Zionist, or I don't even know what Zionism means, and the rabbi says, get out of here, you're not a Jew. So the first thing I would say as a congregational rabbi in a communal setting is that we have to open up our communal settings to be having these really serious discussions with the kinds of people who are represented on this panel in our synagogues, in our JCCs, in our Hillels, and in our I think the first thing is to say I'm horrified that the Jewish community, and I speak as an American Jew, has become so anti-intellectual that we are afraid of debating real ideas. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is a congregational rabbi. Now that doesn't, I don't know if I'll have a job after saying that, but that's the issue. But of course,
I can invite you to speak in Europe if that's the...
So in my synagogue, we try very hard to work on creating open space, not trying to create the one point of view on Zionism, but to really stay in community and create multiple voices, including those voices that, as you said to begin this panel, send us way out of our comfort zones. Now, I think this is a purely American thing. I don't experience that in Israel. On a bus in Israel, you experience a more, how shall we say, loud debate about politics than in most synagogues in America we experience here. And we have to really change that first and foremost about what is okay to talk about and to remain part of the Jewish community. Secondly, I say to my congregants, it is deep in Jewish values to stay in places that are often difficult for the long haul. It is too easy to give up. It is too easy to use despair as a reason to give up. And I say this actually as a pastoral counselor for people in their own lives and how we face trauma and difficulty in our own personal lives. Kal v'chomer, how much more so on the national crisis that we're facing as a Jewish people, giving up is not an option. Now, whether or not we're talking about liberal Zionism, what the language is, frankly, I don't feel connected to the particular words we use. And maybe the language has to really change, and maybe it's the young people in the room today that will lead that next generation of people who are committed to this very complex enterprise. Maybe there'll be new words to use. But here's the bottom line. Judaism demands no less of us to insist that a Jewish state reflects the deepest values of commitment to human rights for every single person. That is Palestinian or Israeli Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Baha'i, whatever. That is the fundamental Jewish value. And I reject the ultra-Orthodox and many in the Orthodox world in Israel who have hijacked Judaism from Israel. This is something we must stand up for and insist that it can no longer be Judaism in the image of those who have power given by the state of Israel to rabbis to be the voice of Judaism. Why is it that if I were treated as a woman rabbi who is of the Reconstructionist and Reform communities, if I were treated the way I'm treated in Israel, in France, the American Jewish community would call that anti-Semitism. We have to create a face of Judaism. We have to create a face of Judaism that a Stav Shafir will turn and say, I'm proud to be not only Israeli, but I'm proud to be Jewish. Why are we creating an energy around Judaism that is about abuse and terrorism of our own Jewish citizens? How can we possibly imagine we can create a debate in which we can be talking about ending the occupation, standing firm in our Jewish values, not just in those democratic values, but as was said before, I believe that those values can be seen as one. And it is only because we've given voice to a very narrow Jewish community's definition of Judaism that we don't see them as being allied. Lastly, I want to say this. We as American Jews have subsidized the occupation. We subsidize the settlements. We are the ones who are paying for some of the worst things going on. Shelley Adelson pays for a free newspaper that is delivered on every street corner around Israel, that is an election and a document that supports Bibi Netanyahu and his policies. It is a free newspaper. The newspaper itself loses $33 million a month. He subsidizes it so that that point of view can be given out for free on street corners all over Israel. It is now the largest newspaper in Israel. I say as an American Jew, if we as American Jews are subsidizing that kind of right-wing propaganda, we must insist on partnering with those voices inside of Israel who represent the best of progressive, humanistic, pluralistic values, and insist in partnering with them. And this is my difficulty with the boycott movement. It is not enough to step away from and boycott Israel. We must get in there and support the elements that are fighting for justice, for pluralism, and for freedom. Thank you.
Let's talk to some of those progressive Israeli voices then. And I'm going to go out on a limb here, Stav, and suggest that the themes we just heard weren't necessarily the Zionist Union's talking points in the election that was concluded a few days ago. Now, there's plenty of linkages, and you've been a voice. I mean, I think you've probably been the illicit and all kinds of machinations to do settlement funding watchdog in the outgoing Knesset more than anyone else. And I think that stood you in amazing stead, and your kind of coming second in the Labour Party primaries, I think, was in part testament to that. You ran as a party as the Zionist Union, which seems to me like it was an attempt to say, we can reclaim this notion of Zionism. Ha'ach Naftali, brother Naftali Bennett, doesn't own the Zionist brand. We can retake that brand. Is that a struggle that you think you can win? And if so, how? And how do you come back to this community and say, no, this is my Zionism?
Hi. Thank you. Well, you know, I know that the results of the election a few days ago make a lot of the people in the audience think, well, maybe we're going the wrong way. Maybe this is not what we have to do. Maybe the Israeli people are not really pro-peace, and maybe they're not really pro-social justice, and maybe this is what they choose, Bibi. But if we look at the election results, we actually see something else. The size of the camps, of the political camps, didn't actually change. In fact, the left camp earned a few extra seats in this election. Netanyahu's extra seats came from the extreme right, because that's what he did during the election, especially the last few days of the election, where he just went more and more extreme than ever. It's not that it's not in his characteristic anyway, but it's the first time that he, I think he really forgot about what it means to be prime minister. You have to be prime minister of everybody. You're not a prime minister only of your own supporters. And what Netanyahu did was, in the beginning of the campaign, he compared us, the Zionist Union, with the Hamas, and then he compared the entire left with the Hamas, and then he compared public sector workers with the Hamas, and then he compared the Arabs, the Israeli Arabs, with the Hamas, which means everybody who is not voting Netanyahu is part of the Hamas. And what he did was to play on fear. And what the right-wing governments in the last 20 years, there were mainly right-wing governments, almost all of them, were doing was to create more fear. And not only to create fear, but also to occupy the very essence of the very basic principles of what it means to be Israeli. Patriotism, they think it belongs to them. Security, they try to make the Israeli people believe it belongs to them. Zionism, they try to own it as if it belongs only to them. What they were doing during this time was to use taxpayers' shekels to fund their right-wing politics, to build their institutions within schools, in informal education as well, in neighborhoods, using our money to divide it unequally between Israelis, give huge bonuses to the settlements, even while doing a negotiation with the Palestinians. And doing all of that, we believe they forgot about the real Zionist dream. We believe that the real Zionist dream means something different. And that's why we had to fight this struggle. And it's about time that somebody did. Because the left camp didn't lose this election because it said the wrong things, or because the Israeli public is more right-wing or is against peace and against the separation from the Palestinians and against social justice. The right-wing won this campaign because we didn't say what we wish and what we want and what we believe in loudly enough. And because the mission that we're part of is not only one campaign, it's about what we do about this dream. It's about what way, what direction we give to Israelis. And for us, Zionism, yes, it means that we have the right for security for the Jewish people in our country where we live, and that we have the right to live in peace and to live in security, being confident about our lives. It also means, like the founding fathers of Zionism knew all along the way, that we have to fight for social justice, that in Israel, we also build a new kind of economy where we put the citizen at the center, where we care about every life, when we support those who are weak, when we divide our budget equally between all of the citizens of Israel. The idea of Zionism was not only a shelter for the Jewish people, that's a really important part of it, but it was also to try and build a fair society. And I think, and you know, I think it was also about tikkun olam and the basic ideas of Judaism in a way of making them come true as a country, as a state. And what we're trying to do, and what we're trying to achieve is exactly that, to put on the table a direction that is secure for Israelis and that is also allowing Israelis to dream. To get out of that status quo of fear and anxiety and being afraid of it. Yes, we are threatened by many threats all the time, but real Zionism is not about looking at those threats and say, oh, we're too scared to do anything. It's about finding solutions to those threats. It's about thinking all the time what we have to do in order to solve it. And it's about looking at the reality and looking at our future with open eyes and saying, yes, if we want the Zionist dream to be complete, we have to separate from the Palestinians. We have to go for a two-state solution as soon as possible, because otherwise we will lose our Jewish majority and we will have to choose between being a Jewish state or a democracy. And our direction is to give Israelis hope. And I think that, yes, this election campaign was not successful and we expected different results. But what the Zionist Union and what the left-wing camp in Israel must do today is to direct a very clear road, to put all our beliefs and all the things that we aim for on the table and say, this is us, this is the way that we offer Israel, and this is the hope that we offer Israel. And if we do that clearly enough, then the next election would look different.
Noam, to come to you, you've been at the intellectual cutting edge, I think, of the progressive debate in Israel, and and your writings and what you've achieved in putting together at 972 have certainly carried to the debate here. Liberal Zionism, the Zionist camp, is that a framing that talks to how you see Israel's way forward and Israel's problems? We haven't discussed here inclusivity, the Joint List, third largest party in Israel today. Where does that fit in our little liberal Zionist conversation b'toch ha'mishpacha?
Well, to be honest, until I started reading and writing English, I didn't know the term liberal Zionism. Because, I don't know, there's no Hebrew translation and there's no Hebrew equivalent. We don't have liberal Zionist, we have Zionist left. And the left and liberal is not exactly the same thing. Like, historically, the liberal forces in Israel until the 70s were, except for Ratz, which deserve its credit, were the Likud party that fought for personal freedoms, and the left was rather authoritarian and socialist in its nature. And for me, it's clear that a lot of the debate over the liberal Zionist ideology is an American conversation that is designed to bridge the gap between a liberal community and an illiberal idea of an ethnic state, a state that views citizens through their ethnicity. And that's okay, only that this ideology ran into a crisis right now. But it's not the same crisis that we have in Israel. In Israel, there's a political crisis on the left. Here, there's an ideological crisis. And you think that by solving the political crisis, you'll solve the ideological crisis. I'm not that certain on that specific point. But to the point, we're speaking about leaving our comfort zone, and I agree that this is a moment of urgency. But it is not a moment of urgency because of Netanyahu's speech in Congress. That's only politic. The one word that wasn't mentioned in here was Gaza. And the problem is Gaza. And what the Israeli public chose is another Gaza. And I think people should understand that. And I think stepping out of the comfort zone is not talking about Netanyahu. I think attacking Netanyahu is easy for everyone on this panel and for everyone in this room. I think that we should discuss the position we took about Gaza, the position Labor took, the position this organization took, and I feel from the responses they get that the public is ready, that our public is ready for this debate. I think people want to hear this debate. And this is the real failure of leadership that Peter is speaking about. It's not a failure of leadership that has to do with ideological obstruction. It's a failure of leadership that results in action that horrifies us as human beings. And the issue that we should be discussing today is not about how to elect the left and how to solve liberal Zionism, and even how to make it more convenient for American Jews to identify with Israel. Israel will be what it will be. An American Jewish community has its own path, and they might identify with each other, and they might not. But America has opened its bunkers for Israel when Israel ran out of shells in the middle of the war. And I think this is what we need to be discussing in this room. And to be honest, in this day, I didn't hear a lot of talk about that.
Pete, and I want to direct that back first at you, Peter, because is in its essence defining this debate through Zionism a problem? Because that ethnic state idea means if our way from the diaspora of connecting is through a Zionist prism, rather than we have our co-religionists in Israel, it's a country that claims to speak to our identity, we have to speak to an Israeli-ness. Is there a difference there? Is that a transition that the community here can go through?
And I think the irony of the American Jewish conversation about Zionism is that we make Zionism the entrance ticket into the communal conversation. If you're not a Zionist, you can't be part of the conversation. That's the ante you have to pay in order to be part of the organized American Jewish community. But if someone says, okay, well, what is Zionism? Then the answer is, well, we don't really know. That's too complicated. But are you one or not? The truth is that Zionism, historically, has been a very, very broad tent. I mean, I consider myself both a cultural Zionist and a political Zionist. But there is a strain of Zionism which does not even require you to be for a Jewish state, right? There is a cultural Zionist tradition which has to do with the importance of a Jewish presence in the land of Israel, because that makes certain things possible linguistically, culturally, even theologically, that is very, very important, dating to Chad Cha'am. And the question of what state formation takes place is separate from that. Right? If you take that position, you can absolutely call yourself a Zionist. You still won't be allowed in to speak at a Hillel because they'll find the conversation too threatening. The truth is, the American Jewish community finds the actual discussion of what Zionism is to be deeply threatening. And I think that's why Zionism has to be a question mark. I can make an argument based on my values for a certain kind of Zionism. It recognizes that there is an inevitable tension between the idea of universal rights for everybody and the idea of a state that offers has a special concern for the safety of the Jewish people given the experience of the last 2,000 years. I have to own the fact that that's a tension. It is the same tension in some ways that I feel to my obligations to all people and my obligations to my family. Or the obligations that I feel to the United States vis-a-vis my obligations to the world. It is a deep tension between particularism and universalism. And I am not a pure universalist. I am willing to accept that there is some element of tension. If the tension is stretched too far, it snaps. There are certain forms of a Jewish state that are beyond the pale for me. But the existence of the tension itself is something that I can accept because I accept it in so many realms of my life. The tension between a group that I have a special allegiance to and my allegiance to all people. The question is whether, I think for us here, can we have that conversation honestly? Can we recognize the multiplicity of different kinds of Zionisms that exist? And can we recognize that people who reject the term Zionism based on their particular definition of it are also part of a very, very rich Jewish tradition that needs to be heard and treated respectfully. And by denying those people a place in the conversation, what we do is we take a communal crisis, which is the lack of creating a compelling, powerful Jewish identity, especially for many young American Jewish kids, and we compound it dramatically. Because we say, first of all, we have not given you a strong, in many cases, rich Jewish basis for identity at all. And then some of your political choices lead you to be out of the tent completely. It's not exactly like we have people beating down Hillel's doors to begin with. So the idea that you're going to bar some people from entry because they fall outside of some kind of political litmus test is just from a communal perspective incredibly self-defeating. So I'll stop there.
I want to bring this back to you, Stav, because if Peter defined a tension that if pulled too far could snap, in Israel, do we suffer from the opposite, an absence of that tension? The particularist versus universalist debate barely exists. It's been so predetermined on the side of the particularist that this conversation couldn't really happen, even inside your own Knesset faction. And Noam defined it as an ideological crisis versus a political crisis. Would we have been better at inclusivity even if we'd have got into government? How do we, if indeed that's the interest, inject more of this tension into the Israeli center-left or the Zionist left or whatever one wants to call it? Do we even need to?
Well, I think the difference, I mean, we're having a very theoretical discussion about what Zionism means and where we're going, and is it okay, is it not okay, what's the spectrum of the tensions that we're ready to accept and what's not. In reality, and on the ground, Israel is still a country that is constructing itself. It's still in creation. It still hasn't answered to many of the most basic questions about life. The question of borders, firstly. What's the borders? Are we willing to control millions of Palestinians, or are we willing to give them maybe citizenships, as some of the radical right-wing parties offer, but then losing the Jewish majority and maybe losing the Zionist dream? Israel hasn't defined yet its economical framework. Is it a country that encourages an extreme form of neoliberalism, like Netanyahu wants? One that deletes social services and the social security net that every citizen has? Is it a country that takes our tax money and transfers it for political causes, closing deals behind closed doors, away from the public eye? And what about religion? Is it a country, and do we want an Israel that keeps the ultra-Orthodox monopoly? Or do we believe in an Israel of freedom that is open for all the streams of Judaism and all the streams of religion? The very basic questions of where our country is heading are not answered yet. They were not even asked during the election. They were not seriously asked in the last 2 decades at least. And these are the questions that we have to answer first. These are the most important mission that we have to tackle right away before we start negotiating the future of Zionism, because the Zionist dream, the Zionist mission is not complete yet. It's not yet there. Israel is not yet a secure and confident country that knows where it's heading.
Is almost 70 years of having the state, almost 50 years of that including an occupation, and apparently it is, given your opening comments, Marcia, enough for you to make a judgment. And there's a question from the floor of where you therefore go with your closing comments, which is, if not 2 states, what future do you see for Israel?
Well, I find it very interesting. I think that you began with me because I've been on this journey longest. And I think that when you stay on this journey for a very long time, you really begin to see that there's a problem on the Israeli side about defining borders, and that there's a real reluctance on the Israeli side that's historic and continues and is unchallenged for the most part about defining its borders and not really wanting to do so. I think that we have, all of us, and I include myself in this, up until very, very recently, we make the assumption that if Israel is to be a quote-unquote Jewish state, and I want to talk about that for a second, then it has to separate from the Palestinians or it has to dominate the Palestinians. So that Israel is a state in which 20% of its citizens today, and now probably the 3rd largest party in the Knesset, are not free and are not equal in any way whatsoever. You heard Nabila this morning, and I tend to agree with her. I mean, her description of what it's like to live as a Palestinian Israeli is very, very troublesome, and it's something that we don't really hear enough about and don't really want to know enough about. I think the real problem for the questioner who said, where do we go from here, is if we think about Zionism as an attempt to create a homeland for the Jewish people rather than a Jewish state, then we have a lot of space in which to think about Zionism. And we have a lot of space in which to think about what this country of Israel ought to look like, in particular with respect to the Palestinians from whom we took the land. And I think that's another thing that we have to understand and keep in mind always, that we took this land and we displaced a people who are now struggling for their place in the world, and we are opposing that. I suspect that it's the idea that the concept that somehow or other a Jewish homeland cannot create a secure refuge and center for the Jewish people unless we are the majority in that state is one that we really need to start thinking about. I think when Nabila was talking this morning about let's not talk about separation, let's talk about cooperation. Let's not talk about keeping control, let's talk about losing control and integrating and becoming a state of all of its peoples. That is what we need to be thinking about. And there is no reason, there is no internal contradiction between that and between having a state that is a secure refuge and homeland for the Jewish people. What is required for that to happen, however, is that Israel must become exactly what it is not today. It must become a true democracy in all respects. If then it were a true democracy in all respects that guaranteed and fiercely protected the rights of minorities, including the governing rights of minorities, then I think we can begin to imagine a Jewish homeland, a homeland for the Jewish people in which we are a minority, because we are a protected minority, and our mission of having a homeland and a refuge for the Jews in case of need is secured by the state, no matter who is in power.
I want to, and again, it's based on something we got from the floor. I want to come back to you, Sharon, and to what extent, and you just did that very powerfully and eloquently, do you think one can make this a conversation also about Jewish values and have that conversation with Israelis? And if I can also add to you, traditionally, the non-Orthodox movements here have gone to the mats on issues of state and religion in Israel, and not on issues of occupation, democracy, rights, human rights. Is that what we can expect again, now that the ultra-Orthodox are back in government, or do you think we've crossed some kind of turning point?
Unfortunately, and I lament this every day, I can't speak on behalf of all the Jews. I would like to.
If Bibi Netanyahu says he can speak on behalf of all the Jews.
I would like to speak on behalf of all non-Orthodox Jewish communities, for instance, and I would like to, I do believe it's essential for us to, those of us who consider ourselves religious Jews, but not Orthodox Jews, it's essential for us to speak out against the occupation, against the social and economic inequalities that exist within Israeli society. And it is wrong for us to only focus on issues of religious pluralism, although it is wrong to likewise ignore issues of religious pluralism. So I think all of those things must happen in a Jewish voice. I do believe in the separation of synagogue and state, and I support those moves in Israel to try and establish that as part of the structure. I don't think that, therefore, takes Jewish values away from the state. I mean, look at the United States. We who have separation of church and state in this country, legally and politically, we're one of the most religious countries in the West. And so I believe in the Jewish values must be center. And I think this is one of the things that the English-speaking world has to offer from Galut to Israel, which is progressive Jewish identity. However, within Israel, there is, I'm very moved to see, a burgeoning progressive Jewish religious community of folks who are born in Israel and are Israeli and are making that its own. And I think it's one of the tragedies of the contemporary state of Israel that Judaism has been stolen and hijacked by the ultra-Orthodox, and that most Israelis, the vast majority of Israelis, do not see Judaism necessarily as a source of liberation and of comfort and of identity, but rather often a place of oppression.
Yeah. Noam, we heard from Peter earlier really kind of a civil rights struggle agenda, and that's certainly something that you all at 972 have covered a lot. But for me, a quite dramatic and powerful gulf seems to have opened in this conversation that has come across from this panel. Do you see the ability to have this kind of a conversation with folks in Israel? The kind of lines that have got applause in this hall today. When you think about and reflect on that, where does it lead you? Where do you take that? Where do you say emphasis can be placed?
I think there's a serious challenge. And I think, I'm not even sure that we started the journey, to be honest. You know, I look at the panel of MKs this morning, and Marsha referred to the really inspiring remarks by Nabila. And I look at the reactions from the other members of Knesset, which represent the progressive side, right? There's nobody from Likud or from any other the right-wing parties. So what happened? We had one MK telling the list, the joint list, that they should have supported Herzog all along. The other one tell them that she should have thrown Balad party out of their union. The other one intervenes and said, no, not just Balad, but Zuabi only, and you can leave the others in. So liberal Zionism or the progressives turned to a group of people giving orders to the Palestinian minority that's trying to organize and fight for its rights. So that was a very difficult moment for me. Because in theory, these are the people we're supposed to be working together in the opposition of civil rights. And if that's their concepts of civil rights, then there's a lot of work to be done. And I want to add a more general point about Balad and the challenge that it presents to liberal Zionism in the framework of this conversation, because it has a broader meaning. In Israel, we've got to the point where arguing for a state for all of citizens, equal right for everyone, is a form of Arab nationalism that should be made illegal, while arguing for an ethnic state that gives privileges to one group over the other is democracy. And no progressive would stand up and call this bluff, not even in this room. So, and from the American side, I think there's still a tendency to view the conflict only on diplomatic terms and not on the human rights issues. As much as we say that we come from the human rights issue, you know, I look at the Israel I lived in, I'm 40, and I only know one Israel, and that's from the river to the sea, and in which they live Palestinians and Jews, roughly the same size of populations. They're totally mixed with each other. They're mixed in the Galilee, they're mixed along the coast, they're mixed in the West Bank by now, they're mixed in the Negev, everywhere Jews living next to Palestinians. One group has everything, all the right. The other one has privileges given to it according to a complicated system of citizenship and where they happen to live and where their grandparents were in 48. And I think that we need to start looking at this in civil rights issues, if that's what we believe in. And that's the kind of activism I'm looking for, not redrawing maps in a way that will keep some people in and some people out so we can recall themselves democracy. But let's have a campaign about shutting down Ofer prison and treating people as civilians because they're a civilian population. And let's have a campaign. Let's have a campaign before we go one state, two state confederacy. Let's have a campaign about freedom of movement. Let's have a campaign about administrative detention. Just that, nothing else. Don't redraw the maps. Administrative detention. Minors in prison, treated like adults, treated like adult combatants. Minors, kids. Let's have a campaign about that. And then we can have the rest of the diplomatic conversation.
Thank you, Noam. There have been a few kind of questions filtered through from the floor on what the administration should do, what activism in America should do. Should one support a reduction of US aid to Israel equivalent of the money spent in settlements? How would you discuss the values of liberal Zionism with student government bodies? Let me just have a quick fire round, like about a minute each, because we've got to wrap up, from our panelists. What would you like to see Washington doing and folks campaigning on when it comes to addressing some of the issues that have come up in this panel? And you've probably given it most thoughts. I'll start with you, Pete.
I think on a cultural level, we need to make it impossible, too embarrassing to be possible, to take American Jews to Israel and not have them meet any Palestinians. We have to make that.
I'm going to do a clapometer. So I'm going to do a clapometer on these suggestions. That set the bar.
Politically, I'll just tell you where I am. I will support, at this point, any pressure on Israel to end its unjust, undemocratic control of the West Bank that is nonviolent and that is consistent with Israel's right to exist. Anything. As long as now there are some which are tactically smarter than others, but those are the two key principles: nonviolence and Israel's right to exist. I think J Street, this is the last point I want to make, I think this is a great moment for J Street. Why is it a great moment for J Street? Because J Street from its beginning has been having to look over its right shoulder, worried about what people to its right are saying about it. You know what? Now J Street's going to have to look over its left shoulder, because the voices, what is growing, and again, a lot of it is because of Benjamin Netanyahu, what is growing strongest, probably fastest in the United States and even in the American Jewish community is to J Street's left. And that is very liberating, I think, for J Street, actually. Because you know what it means? It means that there is going to be a price to be paid no matter what. There is going to be no safe political space, and I think it's going to liberate J Street to do what people in J Street really believe. And that's where I think Noam's point about Gaza is really important. We should be talking about Gaza now. We should be talking about Gaza now before there is a war. And if, God forbid, there is another war, J Street does not need to be silent. Politically, either path. Because either path politically will be treacherous, but the right path will be the moral path. The path that J Street people know is right in their hearts. And I think that's going to be, this movement, I think, is going to grow from that challenge.
Now, I'm not sure whether the rest of our panelists are going to be happy or unhappy that Peter has given you all a bit less time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No. I think you may have done some people. But I'll just simply go along the line. Marsha.
One does not want to cough into a microphone, obviously. I agree with Peter about the pressure, totally, and without limits, the pressure needs to be put on the Israeli government. Whether it's a left government or a right government, as long as they are not negotiating insincerely to end the occupation, we need to be pressuring that government, and we need to keep our eyes open about what is actually happening, even if the government is a left government. I remind you that Bougie Herzog made very clear, yes, we're going to be negotiating, but we probably won't be able to solve this thing within the time frame of one mandate, one term in office. I mean, that's 4 or 5 years normally, right? If it can't be solved from now within 4 or 5 years, then I think we've already given up the ghost on that. Very specifically, I think that the first thing that the United States can and should do, and I've been saying this for a very long time, is start withholding its veto power on the Security Council and protecting Israel from the rest of the world, and in particular from the countries of Western Europe, who are the controllers of the Security Council. I think that Israel is going to be facing, this Israeli government is going to be facing a great deal of pressure, economic pressure and sanctions from Europe that's been in the works for a long time now, and I think this current government is going to give the excuse for that to happen. I don't think we should oppose that. I think we need to support that. I think we need to support the European attitude towards Israel and as being something that needs to be strengthened, and strengthened here among ourselves as well, and not be afraid of it.
Rabbi Kleiman.
Yes. I think it's essential to be exerting pressure and to coming up with creative, and as Stav said, to use our most creative means to think about these issues in order to solve them, to really come up with solutions. And I think that must be coupled with working with NGOs and nonprofits and political voices within Israel who are doing it inside. We must remember that about 50% of the Israeli population, as it now stands, is against the occupation of the territories. And we must not imagine that Israel is a monolith and find ways to not just cooperate with, take the lead from, support the organizations within Israel and the voices within Israel that are doing this very, very important work, and not to imagine that there's only one voice of Israel, and that's Bibi Netanyahu. That's a victory we hand him that shame on us if we do.
Stav.
Sharon said it right a few minutes ago. Netanyahu has very good friends in America. Sheldon Adelson, who supports him and supports his campaign all along the way. And I think that the progressives on both sides must be more connected and must help each other. And this is something that you must understand. When you support things like the BDS movement, you're actually helping Netanyahu. Because Netanyahu's campaign is playing on that fear that almost every Jewish Israeli citizen is feeling, that there is a possibility that the world will just turn against us. This is something that we just carry in our psychology. When Netanyahu came to Congress and gathered opposition, this only helped him amongst his supporters in Israel. What we have to do is that a progressive camp on both sides will work together, that the Israeli voice would not be, as you said, not only Netanyahu's voice, and that the American government would not follow blindly everything that Netanyahu says, but we'll talk to the opposition, we'll see that there is another camp that's offering a different way and a different possibility, and we need you with us.
Maybe we need to figure out, maybe we need to find someone in the United States to fund giving out haaretz on every corner in Israel, and to remove the firewall, to pay to remove the firewall. Somebody here should consider that as a...
Is Aleph Ben in the room? No.
Yeah, I want to join the other panelists. I think we're heading for a very difficult 4 years. Basically, I don't think this government will fall very soon. I think they will last for longer than the previous government because they're very coherent ideologically.
Yeah, but we're going to be a much more difficult opposition to that government.
I certainly hope so. If only if everyone were inactive as you are in the finance community, then, but not even all your party is the same way. So, but I'm saying that we're going to have 4 difficult years. I don't think the change is going to come internally. I think we're going to see a lot of measures, some symbolic, some practical, against Israel coming from different actors in the international community. Of course, Israel cannot punish the European Union or even the Obama administration, although it tries, for these measures. So I think it will turn for the enemy inside. The enemy inside will first be Palestinian citizens, and then it will be the leftists. And I think that the one group which has an understanding of the nuances and a willingness to intervene is the American progressive community. So I think there's going to be a much bigger role for this community to play in the years to come, and we expect you to be there.
Before thanking the panelists, which I will do, to leave you with this thought, I'm not sure another prime minister would ultimately have delivered the Israel that got talked about in its imaginations or its potentialities on this panel. But I think something has become clear, that Benjamin Netanyahu is apparently a gateway drug to a more honest conversation on Israel. And as Pesach approaches, for that alone, Dayenu.
No, Dayenu's for date rape.
I think he creates vulnerabilities. But those vulnerabilities will either be exploited or not. I personally don't think the administration is going to go hurtling at this issue, all guns blazing. I also, in my perch in Europe now, can tell you, and some may be happy and some may be unhappy to hear this, Europeans are not straining at the American leash to impose sanctions across the board on Israel. Palestinians and those who care about Israel and want a different future are probably going to be the people on whom most of the onus is to exploit those vulnerabilities. And I personally look at that election, and some of you may have heard me say this already, look at that election result and say that Netanyahu offered a brand of defiance, but he offered a version of that brand, which is successful defiance. He wasn't just selling, I can stand up to the world. He was selling, I can stand up to the world and the world will blink first. He wins if his defiance remains successful. But the calculations, perhaps not of those voters who put 44 hard rightist members into the Knesset, but perhaps some of them, and certainly the others who didn't put hard rightist members into the Knesset. But the center and the ultra-Orthodox who felt more comfortable going with Netanyahu, their calculations could be changed if successful defiance becomes challenged defiance, becomes rather wimpish, unsuccessful defiance over the course of time. I really want to thank the 5 of you for giving us a tremendously and thank you, J Street, for hosting such a panel. Thank all of you.
Ladies and gentlemen, all students are required to attend the student plenary session beginning immediately in room 202AB. Thank you.
Hey, man. That was awesome. How you doing, man?
Hey, great to see you.
That was a great panel.
Phenomenal.
Great.